Well, thank you very much, Laurent. It is indeed a great pleasure for me to be here among you. Yes, at the IFAO I was able to see Laurent, so a couple of years ago. I haven't been here for a little while. So first of all, I would like just to mention that our current mission is taking place right now at Karnak. And Peter Brand, my colleague from the University of Memphis, is still there until the end of December. So I wanted to take this chance, coming back to Cairo, to give you a synopsis of our work over there. So what I would like to present today is what we are doing right now. I would say that the presentation will be divided into two sections. In the first section, I would like to present an overall view of our project, the methodology, and the objectives and results of our project. Then in the second part of the first part, if I can say, I would like just to focus on one aspect that we have dealt with in 2017, and that was the use of a drone and what the drone was able to bring us in terms of our knowledge of the Karnak Hypostyle Hall. And then the second part of my presentation will deal with one specific aspect, and that is the reconstruction of the Karnak Hypostyle Hall at the end of the 19th century with Legrain, who did a phenomenal work of rebuilding it, and what we are trying to do today. So this will be then the object of the presentation. So first of all, yes, the main objective and presentation. So as you all know, Karnak lies in Luxor, and you have here encircled the Karnak Hypostyle Hall. What is interesting with this picture that you see here are various aspects. First of all, you notice that the architraves on the northern side of the hall are actually false. These are not the original architraves, as you can see here to the south, and this is the result of the collapse of the hall at the end of the 19th century. Notice also just north of the hall these half drums laying on mastabas. So these are drums that were taken away by Legrain when he cleaned the hall after 1899, and eventually these were never put back. So one of the aims of our project is thus to try to reconstitute columns that are sitting outside of the Hypostyle Hall. And finally, notice also, but I won't deal with this today, even in the southern section, when the second pylon collapsed at one moment, then there was also some blocks that swept away, that took away the top sections of the columns here, and the column drums are sitting also on mastabas, but to the south. This is our team. This has been an ongoing project since 2011. So we go to Karnak almost on an annual basis. Our sponsors, especially the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, that has supported us since 2011, the University of Memphis, the Tendi Institute at Southwestern, and other here, thus other institutions as well. So the general aim is to record all the inscriptions on the columns through various means, so we can depend on archives. We have archives from Nelson from the 50s, and also from Kaminos dating from that time, and they have taken hand copy records and drawings of either the abaci that are sitting on top of the columns or the column scenes as such. Since these inscriptions are very often engraved very high, then we are lucky to use either scaffolding or scissor lift, and we even, as I said, exceptionally, I don't know if that will ever happen again, at least in the near future, we were able to use a flying camera in 2017. So then the publication of all these texts, transcription, transliteration, translation, and commentaries using collation sheets and the archive, as I was speaking about, is one of the first aim that we have. And one of the challenges also of recording in terms of photography, what we are doing, is the fact that these columns are cylinder shaped. So it is quite difficult to take pictures of them without heavy distortion, and this is why we rely on photogrammetry. So either for the abaci on top, or here you have what we call a déroulé. So this is really an unrolled mosaic of pictures that are sealed, that were produced on a model, a 3D model, and then this model was simply unfolded, a bit like, say, the world map, which would be the result simply of a globe, so a world globe, so you simply unroll it. So there are various aspects to this research that we try to deal with. One of these aspects is the notion of chronology. So we know that the hall was inscribed under the reign of Seti I, Ramses II, Ramses IV, Ramses VI, and even Herihor. And one of the interesting aspects is to try to determine which space on the columns were carved at first, so as to develop a concept that we could simply note as prime space. So on the basis that the first areas on a column that are carved are probably the ones that, to the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, were the most important. So we have this on an horizontal plane, which areas inside the temple were carved at first, and we notice that the axial ways were the ones that were carved at first and also recarved. So palimpsest inscriptions that we have are strictly along the axial ways. In the same way, then, we try to determine a vertical, let's say, prime space division, and so the central part here, this register, the base and the top are the first to be covered. And again, even on the columns, when one specific space is filled, usually the space at the back of a column, which is away from the axial way and thus not visible from the axial way, are the ones that are carved afterwards. The study of architecture, so we can rely for that on Emmanuel Larose, then who is also our photogrammetrist together with Yves Egel. And so the question of whether the courses of drums are similar from one column to the next, and even the position of those drums that are lying outside of the hall, then can also be, of course, of great value for us through the work of Emmanuel. The question of paleography is of utmost importance. Here, just as an example, you have a cartouche of Ramses II, another one here, but what you have here is the original cartouche, and you can notice the difference with the N here, or the setup, simply inscribed and not thoroughly carved as it is in the original inscription, because this is a Greco-Roman restoration. So these little details, even not only with the Greco-Roman period, but also with the 19th and 20th dynasty, can help us then determine certain trends. The question of the quarry marks, there are two types of quarry marks that we are able to identify. So one like this, like a glass hour, and another one like this one, and this seems to be then connected to the site of Jebel el-Silsileh to the south of Luxor. Anastylosis is an important factor. You will see that there are various areas inside the precinct of Amun where mastabas then, where on mastabas are stored numerous blocks. And the question of color also is something that we study. This is actually quite beautiful. Right now, an Egyptian team is restoring one specific column, and through the removal of dust and dirt, you have the original colors that appear once again, and it is quite stunning. So one aspect, as I told you, that we would like to deal with here is the use of emerging techniques, especially photogrammetry, and the use of the drone to record the column shafts and the abaci. So doing so is necessary, and this may explain why there hasn't been up to now a really thorough study of, or systematic study of the Hypostyle Hall. So many researchers have always dealt with one specific aspect of the hall, but not an overall approach. Is the technical difficulty, first of all, of collating inscriptions on some columns that can reach up to 20 meters in height. The constraint, as we have said, of surface, the fact that the surface is cylindrical in shape. So using the Chicago house method, let's say traditionally, that may cause some problems. And the apparent constraint of redundancy as well, since 134 columns that in appearance have more or less the same patterns of inscription may seem to be maybe a big challenge, considering the number of monuments that have more original, historical at least, inscriptions. But indeed, these inscriptions then carry a lot of significance. So in 2008, when Emmanuel Larose was the director of the Centre Franco-Égyptien, he and the École Nationale des Sciences Géographiques in Paris, as well as a private firm, ATM 3D, moved on, then proceeded to build a 3D model of the hall, and also to take pictures of each column. So you see here a pole, an 8-meter pole that is used with 2 cameras on top and 2 cameras at mid-height. So cameras directed towards a different direction. So it was possible to take 4 shots of each section of column. So there were 8 times 4, so 30 shots taken of each column. So this is the 3D model that was built then, and just notice that, for example, on top of the large columns, the abaci are not visible, because this was very difficult to record with a theodolite from the ground up, because you have these very large column, the papyrus bud, open papyrus bud, that forbid people from the ground to see what is on top of these columns. Well, we will talk about this later on. And so these orthophotographic déroulés, we call them actually the first generation of déroulés. So those were produced in 2008 onwards, and actually the completion of the production of all these déroulés was last year. So it took quite a while to really do this for all 130, let's say 129 columns still standing. So the great asset of such a déroulé was to be able to catch in one single glance the entire decoration of a column from base to top. so as to really understand the overall layout of the decoration and the arrangement of the various registers. So through such déroulé, it was then possible to produce prototypes of facsimiles like this one. Unfortunately, the main reason for such déroulé was of architectural reasons. So for architects, this was very useful because you do see the courses of stone drums, but for epigraphy, it was perhaps not optimal. All the pictures were taken in shade on purpose, as in order to avoid heavy contrast of luminosity, and also the cameras then were not perhaps of the highest resolution. So they are of great use, but in order to read palimpsest inscriptions or even damaged inscriptions, we needed another set of pictures of better resolution, which explains, so here you have an example of a déroulé of the first generation, but of a lateral column. So in the previous examples, you had one of a main large column. So starting in 2015, we then proceeded to make a new photographic coverage of all the columns, but concentrating our effort strictly on the main scene. So this is what we would simply describe as the non-stereotype, non-conventional part of the decoration, as opposed to the friezes of cartouche or the bondo text on top, which are more conventional. So the pictures that were taken, again in high resolution, were only of the three scenes that cover the entire circumference of each column. So you have here our photographer, Owen Murray, who also works for the Chicago House, using, let's say, made-on-measure softbox in order to filter light and allow the light to spread evenly on the surface of the stone, and using a reflector as well to redo these shots. So this is the result. You have here on top a mosaic of pictures. So usually it takes about 150 pictures to cover the three scenes that enroll each column. And afterwards then, using radiometric approaches, it's possible then to have a smooth rendering of the entire scene. So Yves Egel and Emmanuel Larose used metashape, so 3D photoscan to do this, and then so you have here an example of that model with the position of the cameras around the model of the cylinder that is made here, and then with texture also later on you can then reproduce the column. So this is another example of déroulé using this system. So we have finished, so that also took quite a while, but the students at our university, with the help of Emmanuel and Owen, who came to Montreal, were able to produce all the column déroulés, so the 129 other second generation déroulés. And some of these déroulés are actually exhibited right now in Canada in the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. As you go up the staircase on either side of the main hall, you have scaled reproduction of these déroulés, and also in Edmonton. So this is Owen Murray, who himself then produced these déroulés. So this is just to give you a glimpse on the differences using conventional shooting on the column, where you could see the distortion, whereas here you have the flattened orthophoto where then it's as if it was taken at 90-degree angle. So such reproduction then of déroulé allows for an easier reproduction of facsimiles, as you can see to the right. So we are dealing with the column shafts, but also with the abaci on top of the shafts. These are extremely interesting in terms of information. Yes, basically all they have is a cartouche, either from Seti I or from Ramses II, but the spelling differs quite significantly in terms of Ramses II, so we are able to have a range of dating which we divide into 4 different time periods, and also we can detect obviously palimpsests again on the axial way. So in order to take pictures of these abaci, either we use abaci that lay on the ground, so this is the easiest system, or we also use the scaffolding and then take pictures on top of them. Or again, we rely on photogrammetry using a theodolite that measures and records certain significant points on the abacus, and then this picture is straightened. So this is exactly the same abacus as this one, with the shots taken from the ground up, and this is the abacus after photogrammetric treatment. The problem with this system, again, was the inability to take shots from the ground, or even with the scaffolding for that matter, because here you have abaci that are on top of 20-meter high column. So we tried to look for a solution to take pictures of the abaci on top that were very interesting, because they are from Seti I, but there is also some recarving from Ramses II on top on these abaci. So the first solution, and that was a daring one if I may say so, was for Owen Murray, and he was really the one who initiated this suggestion, was to go on top of the architrave crossing the so-called Agatha Christie bridge, and then with a long pole taking pictures on the side of the abacus face. So we were not really very confident about this approach, and really with the help also of Chicago House, who very kindly and courteously let us use their drone, we were able then to have it flown through the top section of the colonnade in order to take shots of these abaci. So here you have Emmanuel Larose and Owen. At first it was a bit difficult, but then things started to go on a roll, and it really went quite well in the end. So this is a view from Karnak, seen from the drone, and to my knowledge this was, I think, the first time that a drone was used for scientific reasons in Karnak. Perhaps for films it had been done before. And yes, so in order to make sure that if there were any kind of technical problem, and if suddenly the drone stopped working, we had our Rais at the bottom, Rais Mahmoud with his big canvas, and other workers just moving and looking at the drone and making sure that if it fell, well, it didn't crash on the ground. Luckily, this did not happen. So these are some of the models that are built of the top section of the abaci. So now you could see, you can really add this to the 3D model that was done previously, and some shots with a rectified orthophoto of some of these abaci. So it was also possible with the drone to have close-up pictures of the clerestory that are even higher than the abaci on top of the large columns. So it is much easier then to look at original inscription of Seti I, and then recarved inscriptions of Ramses II on top of them. Emmanuel Larose was also able to detect certain restoration blocks dating to the Greco-Roman period, and to produce also plans using pictures that were taken from the machine. So here you have again more overhead views of the hall from above, and also the production of section of large row of columns through this. So another use of the drone was to try to then use it for the recording of the many sections in the temple where column drums or abaci lay. So this is simply just to give you a view from above, from an old picture where you see a great number of loose blocks. And these are the specific areas where drums from the hall are stored today. So to the north of the hall, right here, and to the northeast, these are perhaps the two largest concentration of drums, but you have also some more over here. In this section, actually, the drums are sitting directly on the ground. So we have built this season 2 mastabas in order to protect them from destruction. You have areas to the south also, even here, where you have drums belonging this time to the southern section of the hall. So Owen then flew over these sections, and that allowed once again to create overhead pictures of the areas, and then to identify with a numbering system. There was already a tagging system in Karnak for many of those blocks, so simply for identification purposes, then to put them on these pictures. It was also possible through the creation of 3D model to look at the decoration of the various blocks from close up. So that allowed to save time on the field and then to carry at home an investigation of what it was possible to see. Which leads us, I should have actually made a cut here, sorry, to the second part of our lecture, which is acts or aim more specifically to the question of the reconstruction of the hall. So Georges Legrain, who was the head of Karnak between 1895 and 1917, then had to deal with this very complex situation of restoring and cleaning the temple after its collapse, or the collapse of the northern section in 1899, and he took advantage of this also to re-erect columns that had already previously fallen, so not only the ones that fell then. So just to give you some of the results, so it was really amazing to see how many of these columns were built, but as you can see, there are still gaps today. Some sections of the hall are left empty, and especially to the east on that row of initially 5 columns that stand near the northern wall, 2 of these 3 columns are now visible, but 3 are missing. So this gives you just an idea of the situation then at the end of the 19th century, and you could see that some of the column drums fell, or bases, because they were built over talitat that could not support these columns. So some errors were mentioned or noticed along the way. So here you have on a column, we noticed that the lower section of a scene then comprised the kilt, the royal kilt of the king, but in fact what you had on top were the 2 feathers of the god Amun, so it was a kind of mix and match that you could see sometimes over here. A mistake that had been noticed by Nelson is the fact that some column, at least just let's say one column, this one which is column 96, was re-erected but not on the correct axis. If you look at these pictures, so this is taken from the west. So normally these scenes are the ones that are not visible from the actual way, and these scenes should be in sunk relief because they date to Ramses IV. But you can see that this scene here is actually in raised relief. So there was a reversal. This scene, raised relief scene, should be facing towards the other way, towards the secondary axis, which is over here. So something that had been already noticed also by Louis Christophe, who did a remarkable job, almost a kind of database before its time of recording systematically the names and epithets of all gods carved on the columns. Well, he noticed in this 1860 picture that actually this column that is now standing, you will see elsewhere, well, stood at the time right next to the north wall. So this column should be numbered, in fact, 133. So if you look over here, so this picture was taken with the column here fallen. So this column was located in between these two columns, and we can know this by looking in the background. You see the second pylon. So this really shows that the location and the picture was taken almost from the third pylon. So you have a close-up. So sorry here, the focus is not very good, but you have a close-up of what you see. So yeah, this picture was taken from here, and what you see then is the second pylon in the background over here. Now this column today is standing actually here. So you have right now on column 119 here, instead of here, you have exactly the same type of crown for Shu Honoris, and you have here also the same exact inscription over here. So that was discovered or detected by Christophe a while back in the 50s, and we were able to corroborate this through other archives that show the same fallen column. So that's the one standing right next to, again, the northern wall. So this is the so-called 133 column. And if you look at this inscription over here and the close-up here, this is what you see over here on column 119. So two different pictures from different angles converging to really show that this column then is today misplaced. So this is from column 119. When you look in the background, this is what you see, the third pylon. So you don't see the second pylon. So other small details that we noticed was, for example, on this column and only on this column at the top did we find palimpsest inscriptions of Ramses II. So at first we thought that these were correctly located because there are palimpsest inscriptions of Ramses II on top of Seti I inside the northern gate. So again, that kind of matched in terms of the logic. But in fact, it seems that this entire column, column 102, is a, let's say, pastiche column made up of different sections coming from different parts of the hall. If you look at this particular spelling of Ramses II with the mes sign, the S, and then you also have the Sioux sign, this is really characteristic of the recarving of all the Ramses II inscription on top of Seti I along this row from row 74 to 80 along the main east-west axis. And the orthography of this cartouche is systematic and coherent throughout. There are no exceptions. So this is the later phase of Ramses II, probably from year 21 onward. So again, you have these examples here of this spelling on this abaci here, and the architrave on top, and the capital here. And so where would this inscription, this capital, or the top of the capital that is here, would have stood? So we think that it's here on top of column 74, where it is empty. So you have here column 74. It's the only column that is not complete, and which upper section thus is left empty. So the reason why, again, we think that it's misplaced, it's by looking not only at the specific spelling of Ramses II on top of the capital, but just below the cartouche frieze of Ramses II, you have more cartouche friezes of Ramses IV. And here what he uses, whether the Heka Mat Ra form or simply the Ramesses form, is really unique in the entire aisle here, actual way to this column. This is the short version of his cartouche, whereas one would expect the longer version. This is something we really notice along the actual way. The cartouche spelling is usually the more elaborate one, like the ones that you see over here. So with the longer cartouche with the double feather mati, then epithet, or even here with just not the Hekamatra, but with a longer cartouche. Notice also that which is quite specific is that normally you also have the N crown, which is used along the actual way. This is perhaps to guide the reader towards the northern gate, so towards the exit of the actual way, whereas in this case on column 102, exceptionally, you have the N wave variant, which is usually carved on columns that are away from the actual way. So these little details then made us very suspicious of the original position, not only of these Ramses IV block, but what lay on top of them, dating back to Ramses II. So we were able to find in the block yard an abacus with a palimpsest inscription of Ramses II with the Ramesses spelling on top of the Seti I spelling, and again that should be put on top of that capital over here on the only missing column that you see. So other aspects that we have dealt with is the use of pictures from Legrain in order to try to locate some of the numerous loose blocks that stand outside of the hall. So this is a picture taken before 1895 of the area which is right next to the northern wall, and today this is the column that is still standing, column 132, that you can see on this picture. So you have here, let's say, identical characteristics, whether the king or the break on the abacus. But on these pictures, old pictures, you also have part of the column here 131, the one we number here 130, that are no longer standing today. So by focusing on these archives, it was possible for us to identify the blocks in the block yard that then refer to these. So you could see the break here, which is identical to the break here. Usually the breaks are a good criterion to make matches, since the inscriptions themselves are rather stereotypical. They are not very varied in content. Another block just below here is the one that you see here with the vulture, and then you have the same inscription, so the same signs that you have here. And another one, again, elsewhere. So all these blocks are actually concentrated just north of the hall. So this is where all the drums belonging to column 131 are concentrated. So you see the king here and the king there. And if you just shift away your look to another section of that same half drum, using this time a drawing by Lepsius, who made thus this sketch while the column was still in its original position, it's possible to find more matches, and even we have also the top drum here that we could find through this drawing. So Emmanuel Larose, when he came, so this season, one of the objectives was to try to reproduce the system of déroulés not only on entire columns, but also simply on column fragments or half drums, in order to reproduce the same effect as previously. So what you saw in the previous block over here, so this is the connection that could be made here. You could see the hand of Ramses IV going, then extending from one half drum to the next. So here the connection made is strictly of iconographical nature, whereas then by putting the two half drums together, here you have for this block criteria of strictly architectural nature, with the swallowtail rightly positioned, the overall circumference of the two half drums in position. You have the ligne de pose also on top of the, I don't really see it, but it's there, allowing for the placement of the next stage of course on top of it. So these two different set of criteria then complete one another. And so it was possible to make like a jigsaw puzzle, actually, a reconstruction of what we can make of this column 131 through various fragments. And again, even with this type of drawing made of individual déroulés, it's interesting to see how certain courses are thinner or are not as high as others. So this is another criterion, the height of the drum, since the two half drums have to be horizontal and at the same level. So again, the same exercise was made for column 130, the one that is next to it. So you can see these little holes or breaks that are visible today. From the same abacus, you could see here the prolongation of the abacus, which contains part of the shaft that is of the column right under. So this circular section then can be seen here. So that again facilitates the matches. So this picture was taken again at the end of the 19th century, I believe, and this is the actual location from which this picture was taken. So you see the column here is missing, whereas here it is there. Other pictures allow us to have a glimpse on other areas of the columns. By multiplying the number of pictures, it's possible to multiply the number of surfaces visible on these pictures. So here you have again those two standing columns today, 134, 132 that you could see here, but this column is no longer standing today. And here, so all these fragments belonging to column 130 are all located to the northeast area of the hall of the precinct of Amun, and unfortunately, in this case, the condition, the conservation of these blocks are not very good. So they are made of small fragments like these. So excuse us. So the picture obviously is taken upside down here, so that you could see, look at the scene and its correspondence then on these blocks. But it would be possible to have almost a complete scene on all three sides, or all, the three scenes complete today. So the question at one point will be to ask ourselves, after a virtual reconstruction, if it's not eventually possible to have a physical reconstructions of some of these columns. So this is under discussion, and we will see. So the idea is wonderful. The only little detail is money. But that I think that there would be, I think, possibilities for either through grants or through donations to do this. So this has to be thought over. So a last section I would like to deal with are columns that are located inside the hall that are thus standing. So here we are not dealing with gaps, with holes, of columns that are no longer there, but columns that are standing, freestanding, and that pose problem in terms of their location. So you have here an old picture, again from the end of the 19th century, where you see the god Honsu, and you have the equivalent. So this is on that column here, 103. What you see today. So you could really match those two pictures just by looking at the iconoclasm here and certain aspects that you see breaks over here. So again, the iconoclasm. So there's no doubt that these two pictures belong to or refer to the same column. Obviously, what is always interesting on old archival pictures is the possibility to complete inscriptions that are no longer visible today. Here you have cement that fills in the area that was then visible at the time, or Legrain decided to put up a block of restoration where most probably the condition of the decorated block did not allow for the block to be put back into its original position. So you can have a look at that. Now, what is interesting to note is the position of the block above the figure of Honsu today. So the cartouche stands immediately above the figure of the god, whereas at the time it was slightly off to the right. So this is not something unique, again, where you have a misplacement of a drum along its axis. But a closer look allows us to see and notice that in fact these two drums are not alike, since they do refer to the same Ramses IV pharaoh, but here you have the solar disk, which at the time was not there, or the mat feather, which was then on the knee, stands actually on top of the head of the deity. So yes, obviously the level of the earth was then much higher than today, so it's interesting to note that. But what is here quite surprising is to look again at the background of both pictures. So you have again these two same scenes, but in the background you have today actually the claustra that stand on top of the central colonnade. So you are actually looking from this picture at the time, you are looking from north to south. Sorry, it's the opposite. Today you are looking from north to south, but here you see a column that is not in the same view as here. So In fact, it's the other way around. That picture was taken from south to north. And so this is the column today that you see over here. So basically, this column was erected on the wrong side of the axis. So it should be inverted with the other column. Just if you look at that same, if we take a picture today from here and towards this column, we see in the background the same column here with the same deity, Linus deity on both columns in the background, but in the foreground, thus the scene is different. Looking to the opposite side, on the column that is on the other side of the axis, we notice the same problem where if you have a close-up here again, you see a crown over here, you see an inscription here, which is the same in both pictures, but again from different location. And excuse me, really the close-up is not very clear, but they refer exactly to the same scene and same column. Finally, another example is from this picture where you see column thus numbered 111. So that was then, and this is today. Now, if you look at both columns, 111, then it was very smashed, so in a very poor state. So today this was reconstructed and then filled with cement to a large extent, but you can see that it really refers to the same column you have here, the same inscription, so the same area of a column. But so this was simply, these two columns are used simply as reference point to locate the position of that picture inside the hall. But what's interesting is to look at the column which is right in front of that one, which sits on the opposite side again of the axis, and the column that is there today. So when you look at the column today, that seems perfectly fine. You have the secondary axis here, and you have the inscription here, which is the end tail of the normal Bandeau text. But when you look at a detailed close-up of that same block in the time of Legrain, actually you have the front section of the inscription where it actually begins. So again, it is reversed, but it is then incorrect because sorry, I can't really see from that angle, but I think the ankh is there. The ankh, that is the divider between both inscriptions, and the ankh normally always faces the axis. And here it's the opposite. It doesn't face the axis. So here you have a case where it seems that the reconstruction was actually correct, and that the original picture then shows a mistake. And Luc then has published an article in honor of Michel Azim, who also then made that same remark from a different picture and simply believes that there was an original mistake by Legrain, who then noticed, was conscious of his mistake, and then proceeded to correct it. So all in all, if we have a look at what we have looked today, we see that these missing columns, so this column here is actually a column that is standing over here. The two columns here, so one of them is sitting over there while the other one is to the northeast. These two columns have to be reversed. And again, this is something which is quite specific to that column. The same column that are reversed are the columns that have the palimpsest inscription of Ramses II on top and the shortened version of Ramses IV cartouche. So this column from almost top to bottom is made up of fragments that either come from the column that is sitting right across from it on the axis, or literally the top section from another part of the hall along the east-west axis. So one must wonder, how was this made possible? So hopefully more archival work, especially through reading at the Legrain notebooks in the Louvre, will give us a better understanding of the overall picture. So these are simply publications that refer to what we have done up to now. And if you'd like some more additional information, I can refer you to the University of Memphis website in English, which gives you detail on what we are doing. So thank you very much for your attention.